to see so many people I know from graduate school and also people just from Asheville, where I spent some amazingly wonderful time and important time in my life. I think maybe one of the reasons that so many of these are about people who are older in having changes is that I'm somebody who went to graduate school in my 40s. So I have that experience of reassessment at a later point, and it's something that fascinates me about characters. I'm much more interested in the restart than the initial start, so I'm glad that comes through. My stories are quite long, most of them, so I'm not going to be able to read you a whole story. What I am going to read is the opening pages of the last story that I wrote for the book. It's a story called A Country Where You Once Lived, and it's actually the only story I wrote for the book. When I was writing the stories individually, I was writing them very much to learn how to write, and I wasn't really conscious of putting a collection together so much. I mean, I dreamed about it, but that wasn't really the main goal. And then when it became a book, there were, at that point, 9 stories in it, and I thought there was a hole. I thought there was something missing. So this one was actually written to fill that hole. And we can talk about later what that was. But this story is called A Country Where You Once Lived, and this is just the opening. It isn't even a 2-hour train ride out from London to the village where Jeremy's daughter and her husband, a man Jeremy has never met, have lived for the past 3 years. But it's one of those trips that seems to carry you much farther than the time might imply. By around the halfway point, the scenery has shaken off all evidence of the city, all evidence, really, of the past century or two. Or so it seems to Jeremy, as long as he blurs his eyes to the occasional black line of motorway snaking through it all, to the dots of color speeding along the line. Otherwise, it's pretty much all mild shades of green and milling cows, sheep clustered at copses, church steeples appearing at regular intervals in a gentle, reassuring rhythm. It's a fantasy landscape, he thinks, the kind that encourages belief in the myth of uncomplicated lives. Jeremy is riding backwards, so is watching it all recede, and the sensation is oddly saddening, or maybe not so oddly saddening. A scientist, a cancer researcher, he passes his days in the flux and flow between the minute facts of molecular composition and our comparatively clunky selves. He knows well that for all the brain's cellular elegance, it has too this kind of simple, simplistic aspect to it. Leaving is sad. Even just the illusion of leaving is sad. As each view recedes, his eyes are tricked and in turn trick his brain. He is leaving, leaving, leaving. Of course he feels sad. That's what he tells himself anyway as he rides along, that his settling melancholy is at least in part the mechanical product of a cause and effect process of sensory input and reflexive response. Maybe it will wear off as the day goes on, he tells himself. The reason Jeremy Piper has never met his son-in-law is that he hasn't seen his daughter Zoe in just over 4 years. The reason he hasn't seen his daughter in all that time is a bit harder to determine. Some lethal blend of ancient angers and the seductive ease of separation 3,000 miles granted them 13 years earlier. In those early days, back in Boston by himself, Jeremy was capable of working himself into a strangely personal anger at the Atlantic Ocean, as though it were some kind of bully standing between him and his family, as though he were overmatched. But increasingly, he's aware of how much blame belongs to him. The fulcrum of his life, the fateful before and after line, was the year they all spent in London starting June 1996. Our very own annus horribilis, his wife called it at the time. They went to England, he, Kathleen, and Zoe, so he could begin the work for which he has since garnered much acclaim, a study of the potential cancer-fighting properties of an enzyme found in a particularly deadly mushroom growing only in Britain. Or, as Kathleen began saying some months in, on the potential cancer-fighting properties of an enzyme found in blah, blah, blah. Neither Kathleen nor Zoe, 16 at the time, wanted to make the move until Jeremy won Kathleen over with the argument that taking Zoe away from her thoroughly dislikable, probably criminal friends could only be a good idea. But then, just about 1 month into the stay, Zoe ran away from home with a Boston boy, a school friend backpacking the Lake District over his summer break. And she didn't just run away. She left no word about where she had gone, no sign that she had gone under her own steam. Jeremy could only ever remember bits and moments from those 2 weeks, the ones when she was gone. Merciful amnesia, a friend once called it, except it wasn't very merciful because only the worst of it stuck with him, or so he assumed. Like the shock at her absence, as too many hours passed for it to be benign teenage tardiness. Like walking the streets of London night after night, as though she might have become a nocturnal creature waiting to reveal herself in the dark. Like the dawning, nightmarish realization that he himself was a suspect in her disappearance. We're not making any accusations. You wouldn't want us to leave any stone unturned. He imagined himself on trial, wrongly convicted, locked away, the headlines clever if obvious plays on his name. Tried, Piper, lured, own daughter. That was a uniquely vivid memory. But still, there were long stretches from those days during which, for all he could ever remember, he might as well have been dead. That wasn't true of what followed her return. The difficulty was never remembering that period, but letting it go. Particularly his own trouble accepting that she hadn't been abducted, she had left of her own free will, and that she hadn't been unable to contact them, she had chosen not to. His own disbelief at the disappearance of the villain he had conjured and blamed for it all, the man who had been the target of his rage while she was gone, the object of revenge fantasies so violent and so vile, Jeremy had barely admitted them to himself. The man who had doubtless killed his daughter, doubtless done God knew what else to her, and in the process, minor collateral damage, Jeremy understood, destroyed her father. Except there was no man. There was only Zoe, 16 years old, and really, really sorry for what she had done. Or so she said. At home, he would watch her. He would study his daughter the way he studied the animals in his lab, as though doing so might provide some kind of solution. She had returned rail thin, all eyes and bone. Her honey hair was jet black. Her lips were perpetually chapped, as though she'd been drained of some essential human moisture. She looked like a wraith, otherworldly, but she did normal things. That was what kept him mesmerized. The fact that she spoke on the phone, that she listened to music, that she walked through the doorways of their elegant rented townhouse without falling to her knees at every threshold to reflect on what she had done. For reasons he never understood, Kathleen had escaped official suspicion, and she had also resisted the idea that there was a villain to the piece, so she hadn't learned to hate as elaborately as he. That was his theory anyway, the foundation on which he built his resentment, that it had all been much easier on her. So he envied her, and he was angry at her. And about 6 weeks after Zoe's return, Jeremy embarked on a standard-issue, utterly predictable affair with a colleague at the lab, despite the fact that he didn't like the woman very much. Liking her or not liking her seemed oddly irrelevant to the decision to have sex with her a few times a week. The truth was, he wasn't a bit sure he would ever like anyone again. He seemed to have lost the thread of how affections worked. Ultimately, though, the smug satisfaction of doing something behind Kathleen's back lost out to the impulse to hurt her. So one night toward the end of the year, motivated more by spite than by anything like remorse, he confessed. She looked momentarily confused, shock at his disclosure, he assumed, then confessed her own affair right back at him. Under different circumstances, that might have signaled a chance to start over, one betrayal canceling out the other, the slate wiped clean. But as it went, they were like the dueling pair that shoots simultaneously, so both end up dead. There were never any fights after that, not even much open acrimony, just an overwhelming atmosphere of defeat in the house. With all the predictable unkindness of irony, as the family broke apart, it turned out that Kathleen and Zoe had both grown to feel at home in England, and they decided to stay on. It was while driving Jeremy to Heathrow for his miserable solo flight back to the States that Kathleen borrowed the Queen's phrase, "Our very own annus horribilis," she said. "I feel positively royal." It's Kathleen, unmistakably Kathleen, waving from the platform of the Thomas the Tank Engine station where Jeremy's train comes to its stop. "Hello, you," she calls out as he steps down. He wasn't expecting her there. He waves, a small waist-level gesture, one arm pulling a bag, the other weighted with his computer. "Hello, you," he echoes, too quietly to be heard. He's a bit numb as he walks toward her. It's been fully 5 years. He used to see her quite often at family events when she would jet over, sometimes with Zoe, sometimes alone, moving across the ocean with an ease he never thought about too clearly when cursing the Atlantic's role in his life. Over time, they progressed from avoiding each other at those events to seeking each other out as people with whom they could at least be themselves. They even once drunkenly stumbled into a sexual encounter that they tacitly agreed neither to repeat nor ever mention again. And the next few times they saw each other after that, he noticed they'd adopted an oddly jocular, teasing style of conversation that reminded Jeremy of the way his brother Jonathan and his old high school football teammates spoke to one another in middle age. But that was all years ago, as ancient in its way as their wedded days. "I wasn't expecting you," he says as they embrace. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Well," she says it with a slight shrug, as though to convey that it should be obvious why Zoe thought her presence necessary. "I hope it's at least an okay surprise. Can I help you carry anything?" "It is. No, I'm fine." He's startled by how entirely known she is to him, not just familiar or even evocative, but inevitable in some way, as though she were the mama duck and he the little one on whom she long ago imprinted her heart-shaped face and her dark blue eyes, the straight lines of her posture, the angle at which she held her head, a certain sighing sound she would make before she spoke. As they walk toward a small lot filled with cars, he feels her settle over him like a climate in which he used to live. Driving through the village in Zoe's ancient black cockroach of a subcompact, Kathleen points out what she calls the big sights: a tea shop, a pub, a bank, an unlikely-looking hotel covered with a profusion of ivy that Jeremy remarks appears more spooky than quaint. "There's always a fine line between the two," she says, "isn't there? It's conversation for conversation's sake. It doesn't have to make much sense." Once they've left the village and are onto country roads, she asks him if he's seeing anyone. He isn't surprised by the question. It's always been a point of honor with Kathleen to show no discomfort discussing such things. So he says that yes, he supposes he is seeing someone, you could call it that, but he doesn't volunteer much more. Not that her name is Rose, a syllable he loves for sounding more like an endearment than like a real name, and not that she is 34 years old. Not that he met her when she rented the 3rd floor of the house he and Kathleen moved into the year after Rose was born, and not that he is in love with her, marrying her in 4 months. He isn't planning to tell Zoe any of these things during this visit, and Kathleen has always been a bad liar. She works in the university library, he says. Interesting. But her tone doesn't quite match the word, as though having proved that the idea doesn't disturb her, she's lost interest. Or maybe it does disturb her, and a brief display of equanimity is the best she can do. Either way, after a pause, she volunteers that she's recently ended a longish relationship with a Russian pianist, and Jeremy recognizes one of her words, longish, along with shortish, noonish, Friday-ish. A deep vein of imprecision has always run through Kathleen. "I spent the whole last few months with Yuri trying to decide if he was more of a boor or a bore, until I realized it wouldn't much matter if he were out of my life." They drive in silence for a bit after that. "What about Colin?" he eventually asks. "What's he like? Will I like him?" Well, if you don't, you'll be the first, but you will. He's one of those people who doesn't ask the world to worship him, so of course everyone does, and he's very good to her. Jeremy would have given low odds on any husband of Zoe's lacking a little wash of saintliness. She seems much happier, he says, in emails, I mean, as far as I can tell anyway. As happy as any of us, she says. As happy as any of us, he echoes a moment after that, struck, as he says it, by how happy he's been of late. Happier than most, happier than Kathleen, it seems. She's very changed, Jeremy, you'll see. There aren't any intersections in sight when she flicks her turn signal, only property entrances, so he realizes they must be very close. She's grown up a lot, you know. But of course he doesn't know. I'm glad, he says, by nearly 30, that's the idea. We were parents by her age. That hardly means we'd grown up. Kathleen turns at a gap between high, thick hedges onto a long dirt drive. Its ruts and ridges bear witness to a persistent cycle of rain and heat. On either side, anywhere Jeremy looks, vast fields stretch, acres and acres of fields blanketing gentle hills. There are at least 3 barns in sight and a large half-timbered house right ahead. It is as though they've gone through one of those magical gates in children's stories into a universe that couldn't possibly fit into the space concealing it. It's huge, he says. It's enormous. I hadn't expected anything on this scale. Oh, that's right. She beeps the horn with 3 sharp hits of her fist. I keep forgetting. You haven't been here before. And Jeremy doesn't say anything to that. No response comes to mind. It wasn't Rose's idea that he write Zoe and ask about a visit, but it was on her account that he did. Jeremy had long been ashamed of this aspect of his life, this glaring lapse of his, this daughter across the water, but he had never before cared so much about having done something shameful. It was excruciating telling Rose. They were walking. They liked to take walks together in the neighborhood, commenting on the houses he had lived among for 3 decades, but of course never quite seen before. They were just a few blocks from the house when she asked a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. How often did he see his daughter? Even before hating the answer he had to give, he hated the tone in which she asked, a reluctant, eggshell-walking tone, as though she knew she was in danger of learning something about him she wouldn't like. Her voice, always low, both deep and quiet, seemed to emanate from somewhere close to the ground. Her hand tightened its grip on his as though defiant against the impulse to unclasp it. He told her the whole story, but what did it amount to? He had let his daughter go, like a kite that requires too much attention, too much sensitivity to its ways, too much care. Rose listened quietly, and her grip on him never loosened, but she didn't pretend it was a matter of indifference to her. In the end, though, Jeremy didn't write to his daughter because he was ashamed of himself or wanted Rose to think better of him, but because something about loving Rose, about Rose loving him, made him believe that it might not be too late. The reality of his reunion with Zoe isn't a bit as he's imagined it. For one thing, he wouldn't have recognized her if he'd passed her on the street. Ever since the year in London, or since London, as he thinks of it, she's stayed a collection of jagged surfaces, bones poking out at her collar, on her wrists, her knees, her ribs. Her shoulder blades jutting straight out from her back had seemed like vestigial wings, reminders of her flight. But now she's grown plump, round, and soft, as though nature reversed a sculptor's work, encasing her true form in the obscuring one. Her hair is back to its honey tones. The heavy goth makeup is gone. She looks like the woman he pictured her becoming when she was a child, not like the woman he believed she had become. He'd also thought there might be a moment, a few words spoken by them both, something to mark this as a new beginning. But the tentative hug they exchange in the drive and his first impressions of her become tiny details in what is quickly a bustling, comic scene that includes their reunion and also an errant cow wandering over as though she too wants to catch up. A large dog jumping onto Jeremy, leaving prints and long muddy streaks on his pants, An ancient man on a small tractor waving, calling something unintelligible as he passes. The husband, Colin, appearing from a barn, smiling and ginger-headed, shaking Jeremy's hand, taking his suitcase, a tabby cat circling them all, a sense of rush and hurry in the air, something about the vet having been there, about dinner being close to ready, all of it conspiring to carry them through those first few minutes and through the front door of the house with a lightness that doesn't allow for anything as potentially heavy as an acknowledged fresh start.